Good morning, everyone. I'd like to open this joint informational and oversight hearing of the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee and the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on implementation of Proposition 1, the water bond. I want to thank my co-chair, Assemblymember Richard Bloom, for convening this hearing with me. I also want to welcome our members, our distinguished panelists, and most importantly, the public. Today, we will be discussing the implementation of Proposition 1, the water bond. Almost exactly 1 year ago, we held a hearing of the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee to oversee and discuss the implementation process of the bond. Today, we'd like to continue that conversation and receive an update from the state entities with responsibility for implementing the bond. We would like to know where we are in the process of evaluating proposals and getting funding allocated to specific projects that will help meet the state's greatest water needs. This bond is a small down payment toward the larger solution, but an initial step that we must get right in order to take the next step on what promises to be a long journey. This past year, the legislature and the governor took several significant actions to address the drought and to improve California's water security. Those resources are going to critical needs, including water recycling, groundwater cleanup, treating wastewater, clean drinking water, water use efficiency, and restoration. Today, I would like for us to learn more about the impacts those funds have had. How are those funds meeting the principles that the legislature emphasized in the bond? What are the steps that are being implemented to ensure that critical statewide needs are prioritized? How are we maximizing public benefits and assuring that regional self-reliance is being furthered? How are we engaging with tribes across California? How are we focusing on disadvantaged communities and promoting innovative technologies? I would like to hear more about the accountability mechanisms that are in place, and this isn't a short list. All the while, I'd like to better understand how we are helping to make the most of these dollars in the shortest time possible. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to you telling us more about how your work is building the foundation for improved water management and security. At this time, I'd like to pass this over to Mr. Bloom.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank, I think, 100% of my committee for being here already. But there's fewer of us, so maybe it's a little bit easier. But as many of you know, this almost seems, well, it's Groundhog Day, so it's kind of a replay for my budget subcommittee, because over the last 2 years, the Budget Sub 3 has had to approve much of the $2.1 billion that's already been appropriated from Prop 1 in an expedited manner. And we did that, of course, to address the historic drought that we're experiencing. It's nice to see it raining a little bit today. So it's nice to finally have a dialogue on Prop 1 where we're not discussing the need to accelerate funds out of our normal budget process or to make emergency appropriations because one community or another is out of water. Of course, we'll continue to be mindful of those situations should they arise. But I'd also like to take the opportunity now to commend the governor and those in his administration who've been tasked with leading many of the drought mitigation efforts over the last 2 years, as well our own legislative leaders for our swift response to the conditions that we've faced. None of us wanted to make decisions in such haste. However, the situation required that we do so. Thankfully, now with somewhat consistent rain. It's kind of hard to call it consistent. It's only been a couple of months. Rain and flying up here from Santa Monica a couple of days ago, looking at the snowpack and seeing photographs in the newspaper was really a beautiful thing to behold. I think to some degree we've forgotten just how lovely weather can be. We've been, I think, blessed with a little bit of a breather here, but we're not out of the woods. Our reservoirs have quite a bit more space that we continue to need to see filled. So just to provide some context on where we are, despite the significant rainfall that we've seen, Lake Shasta, which is our largest reservoir, stands right now at 52% capacity and at 76% of its historic average for this time of year. Oroville is at 43% of capacity and 66% of the historical average. Trinity at 28% capacity, 40% of its historical average. New Melanese is 16%, only 16% of its capacity and 28% of the historical capacity. And San Luis is similar, 34% capacity and 43% of its historical average. So the situation remains precarious, and we need to bear that in mind in spite of the fact that we're seeing more rainfall. Clearly, though, we do have a little more time to be thoughtful on how we roll out the various pots of funds that Prop 1 has created. And as we begin to develop the parameters for these funds, we should determine, I think, if we're dealing with a drought or changing weather patterns that are going to be much longer term in nature and likely due to climate change. This distinction is critical because it changes the priorities and how we invest in our water infrastructure, and that's something that is important to every Californian. I personally believe that we're witnessing a change in the weather pattern and in much of the western United States that is a result of climate change, and we need to make our investments accordingly. Science is overwhelmingly pointing to warmer conditions over the next century. I don't think this is something that's in dispute at this point, and this weather change is one of the things that's affecting our snowpack. Does it mean less precipitation? Not necessarily. There's a lot that we still don't know about what the changing weather patterns mean. But what we do know is that there is less, and likely will continue to be less, snowpack as a result of global warming and these continuing weather conditions. Projections by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory show that snow water in California is projected to decline by 16% over the next 20 years, 34% by 2070, and 41% by the end of the century. So, this is extremely important as we look at the long-term investments that we make on this issue. With climate change comes sea level rise. We have issues where saltwater may find its way up California's rivers and canals, increasing the salinity of water, which carries with it some extremely important implications. And we should remember that world population, and indeed California population, is projected to continue to grow. California population will continue to grow if even not a single new person comes to California from outside of the state. It'll continue to grow because of our own growth patterns internally. This will put more pressure on our urban areas, and California, U.S., and world population growth provides more opportunity and puts more pressure on our agriculture industry that is so important to feeding our growing populations, and again, puts more pressure on our precious water supplies. So we have a lot to think about, a lot to discuss, and I look forward to our conversations today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And for those of us that didn't have coffee yet, those numbers certainly should jolt us all awake. I'd like to invite other members of the panel to make opening remarks if they'd like to at this time. All right, seeing none, I'd be very glad to welcome Ms. Ehrlers with the Legislative Analyst's Office to give us an overview of what has occurred to date with Proposition 1. Ms. Ehrlers, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Rachel Ehlers with the Ledge Analyst's Office. I will be speaking from a handout that I believe you have in your packet in goldenrod, and the sergeant has additional copies if you don't have it. I think my task this morning is to be brief, given the extent of your agenda, and just to set some context and background on Proposition 1. I'll start with discussing the appropriations to date, give a brief overview of the Governor's 1617 proposals, and then highlight some questions for you to consider both today and as in your ongoing oversight over the bond. So turning to page 1 of the handout, again in goldenrod in your packet and being distributed, this figure summarizes the 7 chapters of Proposition 1 and all of the funding that was contained therein, $7.5 billion, as you can see. As you can see in the column titled Prior Appropriations, as has been mentioned by the chairs, the state has already appropriated $2.1 billion from this in 15-16, mostly in the 15-16 Budget Act, but about $300 million also in last March's emergency drought legislation. You can see almost every category of funding has had some funds distributed, with a few exceptions that we'll discuss here. So that's 2.1. The first row of water storage projects, $2.7 billion, is continuously appropriated to the California Water Commission, so not within the purview of the legislature to appropriate. So of our 7.5, legislature's already appropriated 2.1. 2.7 is not within your authority to appropriate, so that leaves 2.8 in decisions before you. Of that 2.8, about 1.8 of it was approved last year as a part of a multi-year distribution plan for most of these activities that have already been underway. Now, that will still come before you every year as part of the annual budget process, but it's kind of on a plan that the administration has put forth and the legislature agreed to last year. So that leaves about $1 billion in real decisions of activities that have not yet gotten underway that will come before you. And you can see what categories those are here by the ones that have zeros in the prior appropriations column. The largest is the first under the watershed protection and restoration category, state obligations and agreement, $475 million. And that's a big piece of the governor's 16-17 proposal that I'll touch on briefly in a moment. The next, down the $100 million for the Los Angeles River restoration also remains to begin being appropriated by the legislature. And then down at the bottom, the funding for flood protection, roughly $400 million, also has not been appropriated. And that's largely because there's still quite a bit of flood money remaining from earlier bonds, and so the governor's plan is to not start sending that out for another several years. So turning to page 2, this summarizes what I just said. So we can move on to page 3. And this gives a little bit more detail about the governor's 16-17 proposals. As I mentioned, the largest category of that is for this statewide agreements and obligations. The bond, Proposition 1, essentially listed 5 different statewide potential commitments for which this funding could be used. But it really left it up to the legislature to decide which of those commitments to fund and how much to provide for each. So this is one of the areas within the bond over which the legislature has the most discretion to determine the best allocation for the funds. I know that this will be discussed more in Sub 3 over the course of this spring, but just to give you an overview of the governor's proposal. As you can see in the figure, he proposes to fund 4 of the 5 potential commitments for which this funding was identified. The first is the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement. This is essentially removing 4 hydroelectric dams from the Klamath River, 3 in California, 1 in Oregon. This $250 million that's proposed would meet the state's full agreed upon amount towards that. The remaining funding would be provided through the company that owns the dams. The second is the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. This would fund a portion of the state's share of a larger federal effort to bring water to specific wildlife refuges in the Central Valley. The third is the Salton Sea Restoration Act. This would fund a portion of state efforts to restore both problems with dust and air quality in the Salton Sea, as well as salinity problems in the water for the remaining water for wildlife and fish. And then finally, the San Joaquin River Restoration Settlement Act. Again, this is a state's smaller share of a larger federal effort that is resulting from a settled lawsuit to try and resume flows and fisheries in the San Joaquin River. The fifth agreement that is not listed here that the governor has not provided funding for is the Tahoe Regional Compact to address development and environmental issues in the Tahoe Basin, and I'm sure the administration can provide their rationale, but they have stated that there's other funding from Prop 1 available, so they didn't view this as the highest priority for these funds. So again, This is one package of potential uses for this funding, but it's not prescribed by the bond, and it's something that will be within your decision making as well. The other main new proposal for the governor, as you see here, is $11 million out of that $100 million for the Los Angeles River restoration. The bond identifies two conservancies for which that funding can be used. One is the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. The other is the San Gabriel and Lower Los Angeles Rivers and Mountain Conservancy. And in this governor's initial proposal, it does not provide funding for that second conservancy, just for the first. So you'll see that this $476 million total is less than the $673 total in that 16-17 column on the first page, and that's because this really represents the new proposals from the governor. All of the remaining 200 or so million is part of that multi-year plan, continuing projects that were initiated in the current year. Again, still within your authority to appropriate those funds, but kind of on a plan already. So turning to page 4, we just provide some considerations for you to think about as you're approaching this 16-17 budget decisions about Proposition 1. The first and largest, really, the governor's proposals reflect your priorities as a legislature. Particularly around the statewide commitments, the bond, as I mentioned, left broad discretion for the legislature to determine. So this is a key decision point for you. And second, around the Los Angeles River restoration, again, because that's a new appropriation. It's not continuing what has already been decided. So is that the approach that you want to take with that? Regarding the statewide commitments, just because it is a relatively large sum of funding, and it is the amount of funding provided in the bond is not enough to meet all of the commitments and obligations, we do provide some additional kind of key considerations that we would suggest you think about as you're determining your package. First, what's the urgency? How pressing are the funding needs for each of these? For example, in the Salton Sea, there's a big change happening there in 2017. As more water is transferring away, there will be less runoff into the sea, and the health conditions, absent any change, will get notably worse. So there's some urgency there. How important is that to you to address that urgency compared to some of the other projects? Costs and funding alternatives. What other funds might be available for some of these projects? What is the state's role? In several of these projects, we are partners with the federal government and others. Are they meeting their share? We want to be careful that the state isn't paying more than its share, but perhaps in some, there are opportunities for state dollars to leverage additional dollars. So thinking about what the state's role is and what other funding might be available. And then finally, uncertainties. Around several of these commitments, there are some key unknowns. The Klamath River Basin, for example, as many may have read in the press, the hydroelectric agreement was part of a larger package of agreements that was not ratified by Congress and therefore expired. So there's questions about what's happening in the overall basin and with other restoration efforts. You may, I hear, get an update about that with the next panel. But then with some of these other commitments, how much the state has committed to, how much funding the state has committed to providing is a little bit unclear in some of the cases. So therefore, how far will we be getting with the governor's proposal when we provide this funding? How close are we to meeting our commitment if the commitment hasn't even been identified? Those are some uncertainties that we would suggest you might want to think about and weigh as you're making these decisions. So, and then on this, our office is looking at this and doing our annual budget analysis as we do, and we'll put out a publication in a few weeks that we'll discuss, I'm sure, in sub 3, more detail on these. So finally, turning to page 5, we just highlight some more broad overall Prop 1 oversight questions for you to consider, not only today with your subsequent panels, but overall. The first, I think, is a big theme of today. I know questions have been already given to the panelists about the status of the appropriated funds and moving forward. But in tandem with that, in the second bullet, we'd suggest you ask explicitly what kind of challenges the administration may be having, and are there steps that the legislature might be able to take to help overcome some of those challenges in implementing some of these programs. As the chair noted, making sure that departments are selecting projects that really reflect the intent of Prop 1. There were some very specific objectives in the bond language for these projects, and are we on path to address those? We list a few of them here. Really thinking about statewide needs was a really big theme in the bond. How are departments integrating and coordinating with other funds? There's quite a bit of Prop 84 funding still kicking around, for example. How are these projects and funding integrating with those, so to make sure that we're not duplicating effort and that we're coordinated with what we're doing? Do you have the access to the information that you need to do the oversight with which you're charged? And really around this, we would suggest thinking about measuring and evaluating outcomes of the projects. So to their credit, the administration has put together a very comprehensive website with a lot of fiscal information and project level detail. But what remains to be seen is how much that focuses on real outcomes and quantifiable outcomes. And additionally, how will this information be shared and reported? Will you and the public have to go click on each individual project link on the website to find out what kinds of outcomes, or will there be any kind of compilation where you can get kind of a broader statewide picture of what is happening with the funding? What's the timeline for implementing these categories of Prop 1? You have seen the administration's multi-year plan. Is that still on track? Do you think the timeline is reasonable? Clearly, there are trade-offs between going slowly at the beginning and being careful and thoughtful, which we would all want, but being too slow and not getting money out to where it's needed. So how are those trade-offs being balanced? And then finally, as we noted, there are 3 large categories of funding that remain to be appropriated. But even with funds that have been appropriated, it does come before you every year to appropriate those additional funding. You can change course if you have concerns. So making sure that you have the information that you need to make that decision, we think, is really important. So that's all I have for you today, and hope you can keep these in mind. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ehrlers. First of all, the uncertainties and the questions that you mentioned are very good ones to be asked. And as I'm reviewing some of the notes that you've shared with us, how much of this bond and what is being continuously appropriated, what is not continuously appropriated, is there, as you review other bonds, how much is there in common with the way that other bonds have been used? And how much is different, and does that allow us to be, whether there's commonality or not, fleet-footed, deliberate, allow us to be circumspect, take our time to make the right decisions, all of those types of questions that don't always sound like they go together, but particularly with the intense focus on the drought, but also the responsibility to develop long-term water security that is unrelated to one specific drought, that takes into consideration the likelihood that we will continue to have weather events as we've had in the past and more frequently, that we have the information and the method and mechanism to plan for that.
So I think the Prop 1 was very purposeful about not identifying specific projects. And that is different in some ways from some other bonds, really leaving it and not letting the legislature decide specific projects as well, but really empowering and entrusting departments to do that. But setting up some criteria to guide them in those projects. So what they, and I know what you'll hear about in your subsequent panels, what they have been doing is then taking it the next step and deciding what kind of evaluation criteria to use in the grantees. Most of these will be competitive grants, most of these categories for the field. So in terms of, to your question of making sure that this is kind of addressing both short and long-term needs, I think getting the detail around how the departments have structured the projects, application criteria, and how they're moving forward, and really thinking about quantifiable outcomes in many cases. It's easy to make a project sound good, but figuring out what exactly is it getting us. How many acres of wetland have been restored? How many acre feet of new water supply will this generate? And I think that's where we would suggest you might want to push a little bit harder to make sure you're getting that information, and again, getting it in a way that's digestible rather than having to look at it project by project.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from other members of the committees? Thank you very much, Ms. Ehrlers. At this time, I'd like to invite the next panel up. I'd like to invite Secretary Laird of the Natural Resources Agency, Director Bonham of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Executive Officer Landis of the California Water Commission, and Deputy Director Palamas from the State Water Resources Control Board. I'd like to just say good morning and thank you, all of you, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Secretary Laird.